They tore her gown in front of 200 people, and they smiled while they did it. She had spent 3 months sewing every seed pearl onto that ivory silk by candlelight, because her stepmother would not pay for a seamstress, and her stepsisters knew it. They knew exactly what it had cost her. Every late night, every pricked finger, every hour stolen from sleep, and they tore it at the shoulder seam with one practiced pull, in the middle of the bride selection processional, where the most powerful men in England stood watching. The laughter came immediately. She heard it ripple through the assembly like a stone dropped in still water. She did not move. She did not cover herself. She stood in the ruin of 3 months' work and lifted H. chin, because she had promised herself, on the morning her father died and left her to these women, that she would never let them see her break. And then the Duke of Ashenmoor removed his cloak. He crossed the room in 12 steps, she counted, and settled it around her shoulders without a word, without a glance at the crowd, without the performance of a man doing something charitable. He did it the way you hand someone an umbrella in the rain. Simply. As though it were obvious. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. And something in the room, and in her, shifted on its axis and never quite shifted back. This is that story. The bride selection of 1814 was, by any reasonable measure, a barbaric institution dressed in the clothing of civility. Its official name was the Hartwell Assembly, named after the Earl of Hartwell, whose ancestors had established it some 60 years prior as a mechanism for introducing eligible young women to the county's most distinguished unmarried men. Its unofficial name, used by every housemaid, every gossip columnist, and every mother who had ever pressed a daughter into an empire waist gown and prayed, was the parade. Miss Rosalind Vane had not wanted to come. This was not, she was aware, a position she could defend to anyone who mattered. Her stepmother, Mrs. Agatha Vane, had reminded her on at least 14 separate occasions that the Hartwell Assembly represented the single most significant social opportunity available to a young woman of Rosalind's reduced circumstances. That is, a young woman with a deceased father, a modest inheritance tied up in legal complications, no connections of her own, and the misfortune of being genuinely handsome in a household where handsomeness was considered a competitive resource belonging primarily to her stepsisters. "You will attend," Mrs. Vane had said, on the morning of the assembly, in the tone of a woman who had already won the argument. "You will dress presentably. You will not speak unless spoken to, you will not laugh too loudly, and you will not, under any circumstances, draw attention to yourself at the expense of Cressida or Beatrix." Rosalind had said, "Yes, ma'am," which was what she always said, because it was shorter than the alternatives. She had then gone upstairs and dressed in the ivory silk gown she had spent the better part of autumn constructing, not because she wished to draw attention, but because it was the only evening gown she possessed that had not been quietly dismantled by her stepsisters for fabric, and because she had made it well and it was hers, and wearing it felt, in the particular way of small private rebellions, like something worth doing. The seed pearls along the neckline had taken the longest. She had found them in a box of her mother's effects, a small ivory casket that Mrs. Vane had not bothered to appropriate, perhaps because its contents were not obviously valuable. The pearls were not large or particularly lustrous, but they were real, and they had belonged to her mother, and she had sewn each one with a double knot, because she knew the kind of household she lived in. She had not, it transpired, used a strong enough knot at the shoulder seam. The processional was the formal opening of the assembly, a tradition as ridiculous as it was inescapable. All eligible young ladies entered the Hartwell ballroom in pairs, announced by the master of ceremonies, and processed the length of the room before the assembled guests. The gentlemen stood on the right. The ladies watched from the left. The debutantes walked the gauntlet in between. Rosalind had been paired, by some arrangement Agatha had certainly engineered, with Beatrix, the younger of her 2 stepsisters, 17 and malicious with the focused creativity that comes from having a great deal of leisure and very few scruples. Cressida, the elder, had taken a position just behind them. They were 3 steps into the processional when it happened. Beatrix stumbled, so convincingly that an observer might almost have believed it accidental, and caught herself by grabbing Rosalind's arm. The grab pulled her sideways. The pull met the shoulder seam. And the shoulder seam, which Rosalind had reinforced 3 times but not 4, gave. The tear was audible. Not to the entire room, but to the section of it immediately adjacent, which included, as Rosalind became rapidly aware, a substantial portion of the assembled gentlemen. She felt the gown gape. She felt the cold air of the Hartwell ballroom on her shoulder. She felt, rather than heard, the intake of breath that preceded the beginning of laughter, not the cruel, open log, her of children, but the sophisticated, controlled laughter of adults performing amusement for an audience, which was somehow worse. She did not move. This was the choice she made in the half-second between sensation and response, and she made it not from paralysis but from decision. She had promised herself, on the morning they buried her father in the churchyard at St. Edmund's, and her stepmother had taken her arm with proprietorial firmness and said, "You belong to this household now," that she would not give these women the performance they wanted, that she would stand in whatever ruin they made of her and refuse to be broken by it. She lifted her chin. She looked straight ahead. She continued walking. Behind her, she heard Cressida murmur something to the woman beside her. She heard Beatrix's answering laugh, light, practiced, prettily surprised, as though the whole thing had been quite unexpected. And then she became aware, in the peculiar hyper-attentive state of someone enduring humiliation in public, of a movement on the right side of the room. She had not, in the ordinary way of things, paid much attention to the Duke of Ashenmoor. This was not, she would have argued, had anyone pressed her, indifference. It was strategy. The Duke of Ashenmoor was 31 years old, the holder of one of the oldest titles in England, the owner of approximately 40,000 acres across 3 counties, and the most discussed unmarried gentleman in the south of England. He was also, by every account she had ever heard, formidably intelligent, disinclined toward society, possessed of opinions he expressed without apparent concern for their reception, and entirely unimpressed by the standard mechanisms of feminine persuasion that her stepsisters had been deploying since they arrived in the carriage. He was, in short, not a man worth hoping for, and Rosalind had learned, in 4 years of living in Agatha Vane's household, that hope in the direction of things you could not have was a luxury she could not afford. She had therefore looked at him precisely once, in the entrance hall, when the guests were still assembling, and noted, in the rapid, unsentimental inventory of a woman who has learned to assess people quickly, that he was tall, dark-haired, and wearing an expression that suggested he found the entire proceedings faintly tedious. She had then directed her attention elsewhere. He had, apparently, not directed his elsewhere quite so thoroughly. She became aware of him when he was perhaps 6 feet away, close enough that the movement was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look, and everyone cared to look, because the Duke of Ashenmoor crossing a room was the kind of thing that redirected every eye in it as reliably as a comet. He did not speak. He did not announce himself or perform the gesture for the benefit of the onlookers. He simply unclasped the dark evening cloak from his own shoulders, a beautiful thing, deep charcoal wool with a silk-faced collar, and settled it around hers with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which you close a window against the rain. The room went very quiet. Rosalind looked up at him. He was closer than she had expected. She had a sudden, clear impression of him. The dark eyes, the angular jaw, the expression that was not warm, exactly, but was entirely direct, and she thought, with the strange clarity of overwhelmed minds, "He is not performing this." "Miss," he said quietly, and the question in it was only an invitation to supply her name if she wished to. "Vane," she said. "Rosalind Vane." He inclined his head. "Are you able to continue?" She blinked. Not, "Are you all right?" which would have been condescending. Not, "How dreadful," which would have been performative. Simply, "Are you able to continue?" A question about capability rather than feeling, which in that moment she found more respectful than anything softer would have been. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He stepped back. He did not return to his original position on the right side of the room. He fell in, she noticed this, approximately 3 feet behind her, at a distance that was not escort but was presence, a deliberate positioning that said to every person watching, "This young woman is not unprotected." Rosalind walked the remaining length of the Hartwell processional with a dead man's cloak around her shoulders and her head perfectly level, and she thought about the strange arithmetic of dignity, how sometimes it arrives from unexpected directions, and what you do with it once it finds you. Behind her, Beatrix had gone very quiet. She thought that was probably a good sign. The Duke of Ashenmoor's name was Julian Cavendish, and he had come to the Hartwell Assembly for the same reason he came to most social obligations, because the alternative was a conversation with his aunt about it that he found even more tedious than the event itself. His aunt, Lady Euphemia Cavendish, was 73 years old and had an opinion on everything, delivered in the confident tone of a woman who has outlived most of the people who ever argued with her. Her opinion on the Hartwell Assembly was that Julian needed a wife, that the Assembly was where wives were found, and that his continued attendance without selection was becoming, as she put it, increasingly conspicuous, and not in a flattering direction. Julian found his aunt's opinions on his marital prospects tedious in exact proportion to how frequently they were correct. He had been attending the Hartwell Assembly for 4 years. He had not been struck in 4 years by any particular urgency to alter his situation. He had not, until this evening, witnessed a young woman walk the length of a formal processional, her gown torn, her composure deliberately destroyed by what he had immediately and accurately identified as the work of the 2 women flanking her, with the expression of someone who had decided, absolutely and without drama, not to surrender. He was not, he told himself, wrapping his cloak around her shoulders for romantic reasons. He was doing it because it was the obvious thing to do and no one else was doing it, which was a pattern he had observed throughout his life and found invariably irritating. He had not expected her to look up at him with those dark, steady eyes and say thank you in a voice that contained not one particle of performance. He had not expected that to matter. The assembly resolved, after the processional, into the usual arrangements. Dancing in the main hall, conversation in the side rooms, the card tables in the east parlor for the older guests. Rosalind found herself in the middle of it, wearing a duke's cloak and holding a glass of ratafia she did not particularly want, attempting to determine what the protocol was for returning borrowed cloaks to their owners when their owners were across the room and surrounded by people. Her stepsister Cressida appeared at her elbow with the smooth inevitability of someone who has been watching for an opening. "You have made a spectacle of yourself," Cressida said pleasantly. "I have done nothing," Rosalind said with equal pleasantness. "A spectacle was made of me. Those are different things." Cressida looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that the target is shooting back. Cressida was 23, auburn-haired, and beautiful in the manner of a painting that has been varnished too many times. Handsome from a distance but something off, upon closer inspection, in the eyes. "You should return that cloak immediately. You look ridiculous." "I look warm," Rosalind said. "Which I appreciate, as the alternative was cold." "He did it out of pity." Rosalind considered this. "I imagine he had several reasons," she said. "Pity may have been among them. So might basic human decency. I find I don't particularly mind which." Cressida's expression sharpened. "Do not mistake a single gesture for interest, Rosalind. Men like Ashenmoor do not." "Good evening." The voice came from just behind Cressida's right shoulder, and it had the quality of a stone dropped into still water. Not loud, but the kind of sound that organizes the space around it. Cressida turned. The Duke of Ashenmoor was standing approximately 3 feet away, holding 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the expression of a man who had heard enough of the conversation to have formed his opinion. The color that rose in Cressida's face was, Rosalind thought, rather instructive. "Your Grace," Cressida said, deploying the full force of her social training. The smile, the slight downward glance, the subtle adjustment of posture. "How very. What a pleasure." Miss, he said, in the same tone he had used with Rosalind, the same economy. Vain, said Cressida, and then, with a small, calculated gesture toward Rosalind, Cressida Vane. And of course you have already met my stepsister. I have, said Julian. He offered one of the champagne glasses to Rosalind. I thought you might prefer this to the ratafia. Rosalind took it. You were right. He turned to Cressida with an expression of perfect courtesy that contained, underneath, the flat quality of a closed door. Enjoy your evening, Miss Vane. Cressida stood for a moment in the space left by a dismissal she had not been able to prevent, and then excused herself with the smooth professionalism of someone who has been practicing graceful retreats since childhood. Julian watched her go. Then he looked at Rosalind. You don't look ridiculous, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her steadily. Most people in your position would either be in tears or performing not being in tears. I have had some practice, she said, at neither. That much is obvious. He gestured toward the side room, where the noise of the main hall was less oppressive. Will you sit? I find this room exhausting in the aggregate. She looked at him, at this man who had given her his cloak without being asked and handed her champagne without ceremony, and was now inviting her to sit down as though it were the obvious next thing and required no particular explanation. Yes, she said. I think I will. They sat in the east window of the smaller salon, where the frost had traced its patterns on the old glass, and the candles were fewer, and the noise of 200 people was reduced to a distant, manageable hum. Tell me about the gown, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon. The seed pearls. They were sewn by hand. I noticed because the spacing was uneven at the left side, which is typical of right-handed work done in insufficient light. He looked at her. Who made it? Rosalind was quiet for a moment. I did. How long? 3 months. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, but there. Was it deliberate? What they did? She met his gaze. Yes. Your stepsister. Both of them, I think, though Beatrix executed it. Cressida rarely does her own work. He looked out at the frosted window. How long have you lived in that household? 4 years. Since my father died. And your mother? Before that. When I was 8. Julian was quiet for a moment. He had, she noticed, a very particular quality of stillness. It was not the stillness of a man who had nothing to say, but of a man who had learned to determine whether something was worth saying before he said it. She found it, unexpectedly, restful. What is the legal situation with your inheritance? He asked. She stared at him. That is an extraordinarily direct question. Yes. You may decline to answer it. It is. She paused, calculating how much to say, and then decided, on the basis of no particular evidence except the quality of his attention, to be exact. My father left the estate in trust until I married or turned 25, whichever came first. My stepmother is trustee. I am 22. The estate is not large, but it is sufficient. My stepmother has been managing the income, in ways that my father's solicitor finds difficult to account for. He is pursuing it, but slowly. How slowly? He has been pursuing it for 2 years. Julian said nothing. He looked at the frost on the glass with an expression that suggested he was thinking several things he had not yet decided to share. You are wondering, Rosalind said, why I have not taken more aggressive action. I am wondering, he said, what resources you have available to take more aggressive action. She looked at her champagne. Very few, she said. Which is, I suspect, rather the point of the whole arrangement. He turned to look at her. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? I did not expect anything. I saw a situation requiring attention and attended to it. What I am discovering in the aftermath is a separate matter. He held her gaze. You have a mind, Miss Vane. You have composure. You have, I think, a great deal more anger than you are currently permitting yourself to show. She looked at him steadily. Is that a diagnosis or a compliment? Both, he said. Possibly. She thought about the gown. She thought about the seed pearls, and the double knots, and the particular quality of helplessness that comes from having defended something as well as you could and having it destroyed anyway. She thought about 4 years of yes, ma'am, and lowered expectations, and a careful management of her own hope. I am very angry, she said quietly. I am simply not going to let it make me stupid. Julian Cavendish looked at her with the expression she would come to know as his closest equivalent to wonder. Steady, slightly arrested, the expression of a man who had not expected to find something and was revising his itinerary accordingly. No, he said. I don't imagine you would. By morning, the county had the story in 3 versions. The first version, circulated by Lady Forsyth's household, who had been nearest to the incident, held that Miss Rosalind Vane's gown had suffered an accidental tear during the processional, that the Duke of Ashenmoor had gallantly provided his cloak, and that they had subsequently spent 40 minutes in private conversation in the East Salon. This version was sympathetic to Rosalind and neutral on the Duke. The second version, originating, as the sharper observers could trace, from the Vane household itself, held that Rosalind had been careless with her dress, had made a scene, and that the Duke's intervention had been an act of charity toward an embarrassing situation. This Ion was not sympathetic to Rosalind, and cast the Duke in the role of a man performing benevolence. The third version, which was the true one, pieced together by 3 separate witnesses who had been standing close enough to see Beatrix's hand close on the shoulder seam, held that the tear had been deliberate, that both Vane's stepsisters had known about it in advance, and that the Duke of Ashenmoor had crossed the room with the specific, purposeful energy of a man who had seen something he found unacceptable and intended to address it. The third version was the most interesting, and therefore spread the fastest. Rosalind heard all 3 before she had finished her breakfast, via the housemaid who brought up her chocolate and who had, in the manner of most household staff, a far more comprehensive social intelligence network than the family she served. She said, "Thank you, Jenny," and drank her chocolate, and looked out the window at the November garden. The Duke's cloak was folded on the chair in the corner. She had meant to return it last night, but had lost the opportunity in the general management of getting home, and then of deflecting her stepmother's interrogation on the carriage ride back. Agatha had oscillated between delight that her stepdaughter had attracted a Duke's attention and fury that the attraction had come about in a way that reflected poorly on her household. "You must have arranged it," Beatrix had said, in the carriage, with a conviction of someone whose cruelty was also their limitation. "That is the only possible explanation." Rosalind had looked out the carriage window at the dark countryside and said nothing, which was, she found, always the correct response to Beatrix at her worst. She lifted the cloak now and ran her hand across the wool. It was excellent quality, fine and heavy, the silk facing cool beneath her fingers. It smelled of cedar and something else she could not name. She had slept badly and spent the early hours of the morning doing what she always did when she could not sleep, thinking with the precise, unsentimental focus of someone mapping an unfamiliar terrain. What she had concluded, in those dark hours, was this. The Duke of Ashenmoor had done her a kindness. Kindnesses from people with power were worth examining carefully, not from cynicism, but from prudence. The question was not whether he had been genuinely moved to help her, but what happened next, and whether she was going to be sensible about it. She was going to be sensible about it. She was going to return the cloak with a polite note of thanks, resume her ordinary life, speak to her father's solicitor again about the trust, and not spend time imagining that one conversation in a frosted window meant anything beyond itself. She was going to be entirely, absolutely sensible. She was halfway through composing the note when the card arrived. It was delivered to her directly, not to Agatha, which was notable, by a groom in Ashenmoor livery, who waited in the entrance hall with the patience of a man who had been instructed to wait for a reply. The card was plain, heavy stock, with the Ashenmore crest embossed in the corner. On the back, in a clear, angular hand, "Miss Vane, I have a matter of some potential use to you. If you are amenable to a conversation, I will call at 2 o'clock this afternoon, if that is convenient. If it is not, name your time." Ashenmore. No flattery. No ornamental phrasing. A proposal of a meeting with a specific time and an immediate exit clause. She read it twice and thought, this is how a person writes when they mean what they say and have no interest in performing otherwise. She wrote back, 2 o'clock is convenient. R. Vane. Then she went downstairs to manage her stepmother, which was the domestic equivalent of diffusing an explosive device, requiring patience, precision, and the absolute suppression of any visible emotion. "Ashenmore is calling this afternoon," Agatha said, before Rosalind had finished descending the stairs. She had the note in her hand. The groom had apparently shown it to the housekeeper, who had shown it to Agatha, which was entirely predictable. "At 2. To see you." "Yes." "Why?" "I don't yet know," Rosalind said, which was true. Agatha's eyes narrowed. She was not stupid. Rosalind had never made the mistake of thinking her stupid. She was calculating, self-interested, and capable of pivoting rapidly when circumstances changed. The expression on her face now was one Rosalind recognized. The expression of a woman recalibrating. "You will receive him in the drawing room," Agatha said. "I will be present." "You will not," Rosalind said. Agatha stared at her. In 4 years, Rosalind had said yes, ma'am, to approximately everything. The effect of the sudden reversal was, she observed, considerable. "I beg your pardon. His card was addressed to me. He is calling on me. Whatever he wishes to discuss is my business, and I will hear it privately. If you prefer, I will receive him at Lady Trentham's." She offered the use of her drawing room for exactly this kind of occasion. Rosalind held her stepmother's gaze. "You may choose." Lady Trentham was Rosalind's one genuine social connection, an elderly widow who had been her mother's closest friend and who had, in the years since Rosalind's mother's death, watched the situation in the Vane household with the quiet outrage of someone who lacked the means to intervene but had been waiting patiently for the moment when intervention became possible. Agatha was aware of Lady Trentham. Agatha was also aware that Lady Trentham's drawing room represented a venue over which she had no authority whatsoever. "The drawing room," Agatha said after a pause. "Here. You may receive him alone." "Thank you," said Rosalind pleasantly. She went back upstairs to finish the note about the cloak, which she would no longer need to send. He arrived exactly at 2, which she had half expected. He had the quality of a man for whom precision was not effort but habit, and he was shown into the drawing room by the housemaid with the faint air of someone encountering an unusual species in a familiar habitat. The drawing room of the Vane house was, like most of its rooms, a space in gradual decline, the upholstery fading at the arms of the chairs, the curtains one season from needing replacement, the general air of a house being maintained on a budget smaller than its pretensions. Rosalind was aware of all of it. She had ceased to be embarrassed by it some time ago, on the grounds that embarrassment required caring what other people thought, and she had found more strategic uses for her energy. Julian Cavendish sat in the offered chair with the comfortable authority of a man who is never awkward in rooms that are beneath his usual standard, because he does not evaluate rooms by that standard. He looked at the cloak, which she had placed on the arm of the opposite chair, and then at her. "Thank you for receiving me," he said. "You said you had something of use," she said. "I find I am not in a position to refuse things that might be useful." The directness of this appeared to please him. "Your father's solicitor, is it Clement Rowe, of Gray's Inn?" She stared. "How did you?" "I made inquiries last night. Rowe is competent but overburdened. He has 17 active cases of greater financial complexity than yours. Yours has been deprioritized, without any particular malice, simply because it is not his most pressing matter. Julian looked at her steadily. I know a solicitor whose practice specializes precisely in trust disputes of this kind. He has won 7 of the last 8 cases he has taken. If you would permit me, I would like to arrange an introduction. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. She thought about what this offer was. She examined it from all angles, with a careful, unsentimental assessment of a woman who had learned that kindness from a position of power required examination. Why? She said. He met her gaze. Because what was done to you last night was a symptom of a situation that has been permitted to continue too long. Because you have been in an impossible position for 4 years and managed it with more capability than the people responsible for it deserve. And because I find I am not able to simply offer a cloak and consider the matter addressed. She held his gaze. That is a generous answer. It is not, I think, the complete one. Something shifted in his expression, the slight arrest she had noticed the night before, the recalibration. No, he said after a moment. It is not entirely complete. What is the rest of it? The rest of it, he said carefully, I am not yet certain I have the right to say, which is why I am proposing a solicitor rather than whatever the rest of it might be. Rosalind looked at him. She thought about the 12 steps across the Hartwell ballroom. She thought about the champagne instead of the ratafia, and the direct question about the inheritance, and the way he had listened to her in the East Salon, not performing listening, but actually present, in the way that some people are and most people are not. Very well, she said. I will meet the solicitor. Thank you. There are conditions. He looked at her. Name them. I will hear his assessment before agreeing to anything. I will make my own decisions about proceeding. I will not be managed in this, even by someone whose intentions are good. And, she paused, whatever the rest of it is that you have decided you don't yet have the right to say, I would prefer you to continue not saying it until you have determined whether you actually mean it. A silence. Then, that is entirely reasonable. Yes, she said. I know. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to find familiar, that steady, slightly unguarded attention, and then he reached across and picked up the folded cloak. You may keep this, he said, until the legal matter is resolved. Consider it collateral. She looked at the cloak, then at him. That is a rather oblique way of ensuring you have a reason to come back. Yes, he said simply. It is. She almost smiled. She was aware of the pull of it, the almost helpless quality of a smile that does not ask permission, and she permitted it briefly, because he had done nothing to deserve management, and she was very tired of managing everything. I will keep the cloak, she said. Temporarily. Mr. Nathaniel Webb of Webb & Associates, Lincoln's Inn, was 40 years old, precise as a compass, and had what Rosalind privately thought of as the best possible quality in a legal professional. He said exactly what he meant and nothing more. He received her in his office 6 days after the Hartwell assembly, reviewed the documents she had brought, asked 27 questions in 40 minutes, and then sat back in his chair and said, This is not a complicated case. It is an ignored one. The irregularities in the trust accounts are substantial and documentable. I can have the preliminary filing prepared within a fortnight. Rosalind sat very still. Mr. Rowe has been pursuing this for 2 years. Mr. Rowe has been writing letters, essay, ID Mr. Webb, with the professional disdain of a specialist for a generalist. I will be filing motions. He looked at her. The likely outcome, if we proceed, is the removal of your stepmother as trustee and the release of the estate income to your direct control, with a retrospective accounting for the 4 years of creative management. The income itself should be sufficient to establish an independent household. She thought about 4 years. She thought about yes, ma'am. She thought about the cloak folded in her room, and the man who had put it there with the quiet certainty of someone attending to the obvious. Proceed, she said. The scandal arrived, as London scandals do, at the worst possible moment and in the most inconvenient possible form. It was published in a society column, not the respectable ones, but the whisper sheets, the ones that trafficked in half-truths and innuendo, that were read by everyone who mattered and admitted to by no one, under the heading, An Interesting Question of Charity. It noted, with the studied innocence of truly vicious gossip, that the Duke of Ashenmoor's remarkable attentions toward Miss Rosalind Vane at the Hartwell Assembly had been followed by a private call at her residence and the retention of a personal article. It asked, with wide-eyed delicacy, whether a young woman of reduced circumstances and legal complications had found a creative solution to her difficulties. It did not use the word mistress. It did not need to. Rosalind read it at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning and felt the particular cold clarity of someone who has been expecting a thing and been found by it anyway. She folded the paper and finished her breakfast and went upstairs to write a letter to Lady Trentham, because Lady Trentham was 80 years old and had survived 4 decades of London gossip and would have, Rosalind was certain, a useful perspective. Lady Trentham's response arrived by afternoon. Come to dinner. Bring the cloak. And do not, for heaven's sake, read the whisper sheets. They are written by people with the moral imagination of turnips and the attention span of gnats. Come at 6. E.T. She went at 6. And found that Lady Trentham had also invited Julian Cavendish, which she had not anticipated but, she noticed, with a careful honesty she tried to apply to her own internal states, did not object to. He was already there when she arrived, standing by the fire with a glass of wine and an expression that suggested he had read the column and had formed an opinion about it. I am sorry, he said, when Lady Trentham had tactfully withdrawn to supervise some domestic arrangement. This is a consequence of my actions, and I am aware of it. You gave me a cloak, she said. That is not, in any reasonable world, an actionable offence. We are not in any reasonable world. We are in this one. He looked at the fire. I should have thought more carefully about the optics. You acted correctly, she said. Correct actions should not require management for optics. And yet here we are. She looked at him. He was staring at the fire with the expression of a man conducting an internal argument and losing it to himself. She had come to know this expression in the weeks since the assembly, the 3 calls he had paid since then, each one of which had arrived with a stated purpose. The solicitor, a document she needed to sign, a question about the trust timeline, and had resolved into conversation that ran well past the stated purpose into territory that neither of them was entirely comfortable naming. Julian, she said. He looked up. She had used his name precisely 3 times in their acquaintance. Each time, she watched it land, the small, arrested moment of it. The column does not change anything, she said. It is unpleasant, and it is unjust, and it will be believed by people who were never going to think well of me regardless. But it does not change the legal situation. It does not change Mr. Webb's filing. And it does not, she paused, selecting. It does not change anything that has been developing between us, unless you allow it to. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you understand to be developing between us? He said, with the careful precision of a man who wants the answer to be exact. She held his gaze. I understand it to be something that started with 12 steps across a ballroom and has not yet found its name. I understand that you come here more than the business requires. I understand that when you listen to me I feel, for the first time in 4 years, like a person whose thoughts are worth the air they travel through. She stopped. I also understand that you have not said what the rest of it is, and I told you not to say it until you were certain you meant it. Are you certain? Julian Cavendish stood very still for a moment. Then he said, Yes. Then say it. I am in love with you, he said, with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which he had placed a cloak around her shoulders in the Hartwell ballroom. Simply, directly, as though it were the obvious thing and required no additional performance. I have been in some form of love with you since you lifted your chin in the middle of that room and refused to be broken. I did not say so because I was. I needed to determine that it was not simply admiration, or the desire to fix an unjust situation, or any of the other things it might have been mistaken for. He crossed the room, not 12 steps this time, 5, and stood before her with the same quality of attention he always had, total, unhurried, entirely without artifice. "It is not any of those things," he said. "It is considerably simpler and considerably more inconvenient, and I find I cannot be sorry about it." Rosalind looked at him. She thought about 4 years of careful management. She thought about the precise, unsentimental arithmetic of hope. She thought about the woman she had been the night of the assembly, standing in the ruin of a gown she had made with her own hands, in a room full of people waiting for her to break, and how she had chosen, in that moment, to be unbreakable. She had spent 4 years not allowing herself to want things she could not be certain of. She thought, perhaps, she had been careful long enough. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since you handed me champagne instead of ratafia without explaining why, which sounds trivial but is in fact the most telling thing a person can do." He almost smiled. "Champagne is objectively superior." "Exactly," she said. "You chose correctly without being asked. That is the whole thing, Julian. That is all of it." He looked at her for a moment in the firelit drawing room of Lady Trentham's house, while the snow that had been threatening since morning finally arrived against the windows, and then he took her hand with the same simplicity he brought to everything. No ceremony, no performance, simply present and decided, and she let him take it and thought, "Not careful. Not careful anymore." The legal matter was resolved in March. Mr. Webb was, as advertised, considerably more effective than letters. The preliminary filing produced a response from Agatha Vane's solicitor that was so full of procedural delay as to be essentially an admission of guilt, and the court's ruling, delivered on a grey Tuesday that felt, to Rosalind, like the most consequential Tuesday of her life, removed Agatha as trustee, released 4 years of managed income for retrospective accounting, and placed the estate fully in Rosalind's control. She sat in Mr. Webb's office for a moment after he read the judgment, holding the document in both hands. She had spent 4 years treating the estate as a theoretical thing, something that existed in papers and trust law and Mr. Rowe's apologetic letters, but had no material reality. Holding the judgment made it real in the way that only paper makes things real when the law is involved, and she felt the weight of it. Not the relief she had expected, or not only relief, but something larger and more complex, the particular gravity of having been restored to yourself after a long time away. "Well done, Mr. Webb," she said. He inclined his head. "The retrospective accounting will take some additional time, but the outcome is not in doubt. You should have a full accounting by June." She walked out into the March street with the judgment in her bag and the cold spring air on her face and stood for a moment in the grey light, thinking about beginnings. Julian was waiting outside. He had not come in. He had learned, in the months since November, the precise calibration of when his presence was useful and when it was an intrusion, which was one of the many things about him she had come to value with a specificity that surprised her. He stood on the pavement in his greatcoat with his hands in his pockets, looking at the middle distance, and turned when he heard her. She held up the document. Something moved in his face, brief, warm, the expression she had privately catalogued as the one he wore when something genuinely mattered to him. He crossed to her in 4 steps. She had long since stopped counting steps, but she would count these, she thought, for the rest of her life, and took the document from her, read the operative paragraph, and handed it back. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you." She put the document back in her bag. "For Mr. Webb. For all of it. Webb did the work. Webb did the legal work," she said. "You did the rest of it. You have been doing, since November, the kind of steady, patient, practical support that I did not know how to ask for and did not have to ask for, because you simply—" She stopped. She had not meant to say all of that. He was looking at her with the unguarded attention that she no longer tried to meet without feeling. "Rosalind," he said. "Yes. I have been trying to determine," he said, the correct moment to ask you something. I have concluded that there is no perfect moment, and I should simply ask. Then ask." He took a breath, which was uncharacteristic. He was not, as a rule, a man who needed preparatory breaths. It moved her, that small evidence of feeling. "Will you marry me?" he said. No preamble, no speech. The same simplicity he brought to everything. She looked at him. She thought about the night of the Hartwell assembly, the torn gown, the laughter, the 12 steps, the cloak settling warm around her shoulders. She thought about everything that had been building since then. The solicitor, the conversations, the snow against the windows of Lady Trentham's drawing room, the careful patient months of a man who never once pressed her toward something she had not chosen. She thought about the woman she had been, standing in the ruin of 3 months' work, and the woman she was now, standing on a March pavement with a court judgment in her bag and her inheritance in her own hands, and the person she loved asking her, simply and directly, for her future. "Yes," she said. Simply. As though it were obvious. He smiled. A real smile, the kind she had come to think of as the rarest and therefore the most valuable of his expressions, the one that reached his eyes and made him look, for a moment, entirely young. He took her hand. "Good," he said. She laughed. A real laugh, warm and unmanaged, the kind she had been suppressing for 4 years on the grounds that Agatha found it too loud and Beatrix found it irritating. It came out before she could think to contain it, and she let it stay, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely new and entirely clear, and she thought she would be collecting expressions for the rest of her life and never running out of new ones to find. "The cloak," she said. He looked at her. "What about it?" "I have been keeping it as collateral. You should know that the legal matter being resolved does not mean I intend to return it." He looked at her steadily. No. I have become rather attached to it." She held his gaze. "You will simply have to come and get it, on whatever recurring basis you find appropriate." Something in his face moved, the almost smile, the real one beneath it, the one she had been cataloguing since November and never once misread. "That," he said, "seems like a very satisfactory arrangement." She agreed with him, which she discovered was, for the first time in a very long time, an entirely easy thing to do. They were married in June, in the church at St. Edmund's, where her father was buried in the churchyard. Lady Trentham cried, which she would later deny. Mr. Webb attended as a guest and sat in the 3rd pew with the satisfied expression of a man who had filed a very good motion. The stepsisters were not invited. Agatha Vane received the retrospective accounting in August. It was, by all accounts, a thorough document. Rosalind wore her mother's pearls. Not on a gown, that gown was gone, and she had not replaced it. On a ribbon at her throat, where she could feel them when she turned her head. Small and real and hers, saved from the same ivory casket, the same careful fingers, the same woman who had taught her, by example and by love, that the things worth having are always worth the effort of the double knot. She touched them once, in the vestibule of St. Edmund's, before she walked in. Then she lifted her chin, old habit, the best one she had, and walked forward into the light.